Sometimes the road to somewhere leads us to the middle of nowhere. All that we're running from seems to stay right behind us, while all that God is leading us to seems to be getting further and further away. As the miles pass, it's easy to feel alone. It's easy to feel lost. And yet, if we know what to look for, the reminders of God's faithfulness are all around us, shaping us, molding us, preparing us for what's ahead. Sometimes the road to somewhere leads us to the middle of nowhere. The road can be hard. The road can seem to stretch forever. There will be moments of frustration, moments of doubt, moments when you want to quit. But as we learn to trust God and follow where He leads, we may just find that some of our best growth happens in the wilderness.
We're in week 3 of this conversation about the seasons of life that take us to the forgotten places of the world, places where the wilderness looms large. And at the beginning of this conversation, I shared with you all a little bit about Bear Grylls. And he's an adventurer who turned his bent for seeking expeditions in the wilderness into a television network deal with Man vs. Wild and all the various iterations and spin-offs and shows that have kind of tried to imitate it. And what you might remember if you were with us then, or if you've ever seen the show, essentially he goes with a camera crew to the middle of nowhere, and they kind of set up worst-case scenarios where he explains extreme survival skills. Right, so if you ever find yourself having to cross an icy river in the Canadian winter, he's got you covered, right? If you ever need to figure out, how to survive by knowing which bugs have the best protein content and are the most nutritional, he can tell you all about that. The show can be a bit extreme. And you might remember that we saw at the beginning of this conversation that off camera, he will readily admit that the show is largely staged, that they manufacture the crises so that there's something to actually show. Because his take, and I think it's the right one, would be that if you ever actually find yourself in the wild, it's pretty mundane. In fact, he says, if you find yourself lost in the wilderness, your best course of action is to find a place that you feel safe, get comfortable, settle in, and wait for somebody to come rescue you. Right? We like to think of this idea of being in the wilderness as it's, this incredible adventure, and there's danger around every turn, when in reality it's far less eventful than that most often. Right? We like the romanticized idea of surviving the wilderness as this sort of swashbuckling adventure, but it often isn't. Oftentimes in the wilderness are pretty mundane. They feel pretty uneventful. And so, if you're lost, if you feel that you don't know where to go, the chances are it's possible and even likely that you're going to make your situation worse by doing anything other than settling in and waiting for someone to rescue you. Right? You're going to make it worse because you're going to take off in the wrong direction. Or maybe you're going to take off in the right direction, only to find out that between here and there, there's something you didn't know about that means you can't get there from here. You're going to find opportunities where you went this way when you should have gone that way. You turned west when you should have turned south. And for some of us, we're not even really sure which direction, north, south, east, or west is. And so we could find ourselves getting further and further from the very people who were coming to rescue us. See, the trouble with life in the wilderness is that when you don't know where you are, it makes getting where you want to be kind of difficult. And yet we have this tendency to want to set off on our own, which highlights the way that the wilderness can leave us feeling lost, can leave us feeling aimless. And I think there are some principles in that carry over to Israel's time in the wilderness in the Old Testament, and some principles that can carry over to help us as we try to navigate and survive the seasons of our own lives when we find ourselves living in the wilderness. And so to get us started today, I want to introduce a big idea to us that we'll kind of walk through. If you're following along in the YouVersion Bible app on your phone or a tablet, just go to the Events tab. Everything on the screen will be there for you. You can jot some things down, take some notes. But the big idea we want to work through today begins like this. The wilderness can seem aimless. You need someone to lead you. Seasons in the wilderness can feel very aimless. You need someone to lead you. Today, as we continue looking at Israel's time in the wilderness, this time following the Exodus from Egypt, we're going to push the fast forward button a bit if you've been tracking with us through the first couple of weeks here. Because we've spent the first 2 weeks really kind of nestled down in this moment when God appears to Moses in a burning bush on Mount Sinai and commissions him, "Go to Egypt and deliver my people." We've spent the last couple of weeks looking at this encounter that Moses has with God. And now we want to kind of fast forward a little bit, and we're actually going to kind of jump over the Exodus itself, which might seem a little counterintuitive, right? Because over the first couple of weeks of this, we've been talking about the way that the Exodus event, God rescuing his people from slavery in Egypt, becomes the sort of identifying marker of God's people. It becomes the moment that transforms their shared experience as the people of God. And it's also the moment that God chooses throughout the Old Testament to refer back to anchor his identity. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Right? This is a quintessential transformational moment. And so it might seem a little bit counterintuitive to say, yeah, we're just going to jump right over that. But I think it makes sense for us in this conversation for two specific reasons. First, the Exodus itself is not about time in the wilderness. The Exodus is about time spent in and getting out of Egypt, which is a whole other conversation in itself that we can have at another time. But the other thing is, the destination of the Exodus was never intended to be the wilderness. Right? The destination for the Exodus was always supposed to be the Promised Land. And so, if we're talking about the time that Israel spent in the wilderness, the Exodus itself is a gateway to that wilderness season. It is the transitional event in the life of God's people that makes everything that comes after it a part of their story. So last week, when we left off, God had commissioned Moses to go to Egypt and rescue his people. And if you know the story, you'll remember how this goes. God tells Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh, tell him to release my people. Moses, I am sending you. And God makes the promise to him, I will be with you. And Moses, this is how you'll know, when you've delivered the people, you will worship me again on this mountain. So God has commissioned Moses to go back to Pharaoh. Now, there's some back and forth between God and Moses because Moses is not entirely sure he's the guy for the job. Again, another conversation for another time. Ultimately, Moses returns to Egypt, and God unleashes a series of plagues on the land and the people of Egypt in order to show his superiority over the Egyptians' gods, and ultimately to convince Pharaoh to let his people go, because Pharaoh is reluctant to turn loose this free workforce that Egypt has been benefiting from for the last 400 years. And so through a series of plagues, ultimately Pharaoh relents, tells Moses to take the people and go, only to then change his mind. And when Pharaoh changes his mind, he sends his army after the fleeing slaves. And if you're familiar with the story, you'll remember that when they come to the shore of the Red Sea, they feel trapped. They feel like they have no place to go. And God parts the waters of the Red Sea so that they can cross on dry ground. And to protect them from the advancing Egyptian army, the presence of God descends behind them in a darkened cloud to the Egyptian side and a light of fire to the Israelite side. Okay, so we're picturing this. God puts himself between his people and the pursuing Egyptian army. Parts the waters so that they can walk through on dry ground, and ultimately brings his people back to Mount Sinai. They're going to set up camp at Sinai and spend a year encamped at the foot of the mountain. And while they are there, Moses is receiving the Torah, the law from God. And the people are learning what it is for them to live in a covenant relationship with a holy God. Okay? So that's the setup of everything that has happened since we last left this conversation God is having with Moses. The people are finding themselves in the wilderness, encamped at Mount Sinai. And as a part of the instructions that God gives to Moses, we find a description for how they are to arrange their camp for their time in the wilderness. I invite you to turn with me to Numbers chapter 2, 9, there we go, sorry. I wrote down verses and not a chapter. Numbers chapter 9 today is where we want to begin. I'm sorry, no, I was right the first time. Numbers chapter 2. We're going to get to Numbers 9. I got ahead. That's why I'm confused. All right, Numbers chapter 2. Let's try this again. Verses 1 and 2 is where we want to begin. Again, all this will be there for you in the YouVersion app. If you're following along, we'll also have it on the screen. Verse number 1, Numbers 2. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, the Israelites are to camp around the tent of meeting, some distance from it, each man under his standard with the banners of his family. The text is then immediately going to begin to tell us about the specifics of that. It's a whole lot of procedural material for the next several verses. At the end of chapter 2, listen to what the text tells us. So the Israelites did everything the Lord commanded Moses, and that is the way they encamped under their standards, and that is the way they set out, each with his clan and his family. So we begin to get a sense of how the people of God are going to survive their time in the wilderness. And since God doesn't change, since he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, it means that as we look into this, there are some opportunities for us to learn some principles about God, who he is, what he's like, that we can then kind of grab a hold of to help us as we navigate our own seasons in the wilderness. So Numbers chapter 2 tells us that God tells the Israelites, this is how you're supposed to encamp. If we can get this graphic up here, the next several verses of Numbers chapter 2 describe what you see in this image. Each of the tribes is directed to set up their camp under their tribal banners in a certain specific place around the tent of meeting, around the tabernacle. And at each time they break camp or make camp, this is how they are to set up the camp. It's not a random pick. We were next to these guys last time. We want new neighbors this time. They are instructed to arrange the camp in this manner throughout the time they spend in the wilderness. And at the heart of the Israelite camp, we find the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, at the center. Numbers 2 again tells us this arrangement of the tribes. When we get to Numbers 9, see, told you we were going to be in Numbers 9. When we get to Numbers 9, we start to see the significance of why the camp is laid out this way with the tabernacle at the center. So jump over with me, Numbers chapter 9, starting in verse 15. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, was set up, the cloud covered it. What cloud? The one from the Red Sea. Darkened on the Egyptian side, fiery on the Israelite side. The cloud covered over the tabernacle. From evening until morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. And this is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night, it looked like fire. Okay, so we begin to get a sense of what the significance is of the tabernacle being at the heart of the Israelite camp. The tabernacle itself is a sort of portable worship center. It was comprised of several large panels that made a courtyard, and in the center of the courtyard was a tent. And the tent was divided into two sections. In the first part of the tent, which was larger, there were the sacrificial instruments for the priests. And the people would gather outside in the courtyard for worship. And then behind that, or inside that tent, behind the large section was a smaller room called the holiest place, or the Holy of Holies. And it was there that the Ark of the Covenant, that was the symbol of God's presence with his people, dwelt there at the center of the tabernacle, at the center of the Israelite camp. And so this portable sanctuary would be set up whenever they made camp. And Numbers 9 tells us that as that is happening, the cloud came and settled over the tabernacle. And here, in the midst of the wilderness, in the midst of the Israelite camp, the presence of God dwelt with his people. What did God tell Moses when he commissioned him? Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt, and I will be with you. And we see the tangible fulfillment of that promise. There can be no doubt, Moses, that God is with you, because the fiery cloud of his presence hovers over the tabernacle at the heart of the camp. Here's what I've seen happen in wilderness type seasons in my own life. When you find yourself in the wilderness, it's really easy to forget that you aren't alone. Right? The wilderness has a way of making you think that everyone is gone, no one understands, you're by yourself. And if you'll allow it, the wilderness will do its best to convince you that God himself has abandoned you. You're just on your own. And we don't often get this physical reminder of the presence of God with his people. But as followers of Jesus, as we strive to shape our lives by the ways and words of Jesus, we can find it to be true what Jesus told the disciples before he returned to his Father. I will be with you always to the end of the age. Right? That the presence of God does not suddenly become absent when we find ourselves in the wilderness. God has committed himself to be with his people so that his people can ultimately be with him. And so you may not find yourself in a literal wilderness encamped with tribes of people. But there are principles at play about who God is and what he's like that can help us to survive our time in the wilderness. It's there in the teaching notes if you want to jot it down. We'll have it on the screen for you. The wilderness is often the place we learn to center our faith around the presence of God. We don't always like the wilderness. Rarely is it a good time. But the wilderness is often the place, the seasons of life, where we learn to center our faith around the presence of God. Where we learn in practice what it means to worship and follow a God who has said, I will be with you. Right? Because the wilderness wants to leave you alone, wants to leave you feeling abandoned, wants to leave you afraid. But as our faith becomes the hub of our life, we can know that we are not there alone. Right? And so the wilderness is often this place that we learn to center our faith around the presence of God. But in the wilderness, Israel's journey was about more than just setting up camp in the desert. Right? Like, if that's all there is to it, great. Like, center life on the presence of God and hope everything works out okay. But their journey into the wilderness wasn't about more than setting up camp in the desert. The purpose of Israel being in the wilderness at this moment in the life of God's people was because God was leading them somewhere, which is easy to forget when you're stuck in the middle of the wilderness. But what did God say to Moses in Exodus 3, the text we've been in the last couple weeks? Moses, I have heard the cry of my people in Egypt. I am concerned about their suffering, and I have come down to rescue them. I have come down to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. God brought his people out of Egypt so he could bring them through the wilderness. So the purposes of God were about far more than just setting up camp in the wilderness. But remember, when you find yourself in the wilderness, what's the best thing you can do if you're lost and don't know what to do? Hunker down. Set up camp. And wait for someone to rescue you. But here's the thing, when the rescuer shows up, you follow where they lead. Right? If you find yourself lost in the wilderness and you're hunkered down waiting for rescue, and then a rescue team shows up and says, we're here to save you. Nobody's going to be like, you know what, no, we good. It's all right. When the rescuer shows up, you follow where they lead. So let's go back to Numbers 15 here. Let's press a little further into this text. Let's pick it back up in verse 15 where we read it before. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of testimony, was set up, the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. And that's how it continued to be. The cloud covered it. And at night it looked like fire. Verse 17. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Wherever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. And at the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. When the cloud remained over the tabernacle a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days, and at the Lord's command they would encamp. And then at his command they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening until morning, and when it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in the camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command they encamped, and at the Lord's command they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. So the presence of God hovers over the tent of meeting at the heart of the Israelite camp. The tangible presence of God with his people. And when the cloud moves, the people move. And when the cloud stops, the people stop. So here are the people of God as escaped slaves, wandering in the wilderness, learning what it means to center their faith. But they're also learning that because they're centering their faith, they could know when to move. I think if familiar with the story, sometimes we know it so well that we just breeze right past this. And we miss just how chaotic this had to feel at times. And just how frustrating it had to feel at other times. But here are the people of God learning what it is to center faith. And learning what it is to know when it's time to move. There in the teaching notes again, see, the wilderness is often the place we learn to center our faith so that we can follow where God leads. It's not simply that we center our faith. It's that we learn to center our faith so that we can follow where God leads. One thing I love about the text of Scripture is it has this uncanny ability to anticipate our what-if questions. Right? Like you read this text and you're like, okay, so just some logistics here. So what if the cloud settles in last night and then this morning the cloud lifts up and begins to move? Pack it all up, baby. God's on the move. Oh, okay. So what if the cloud just descends and just kind of hangs out for like a year? Do we just sit and wait in the middle of nowhere? Yeah. Settle in. Trust that God knows how and when and where to lead you. Now think about it. Like, again, we breeze right past. Think about how chaotic this has to feel. They're in the wilderness with roughly 600,000 people. The cloud stops and settles, and we set up camp. That's got to be a process. And then the next morning, the cloud lifts, and we got to move. I'm only imagining there had to be days when they put the last panel of the tabernacle up, just in time for the cloud to lift and take it all back down. And I'm sure there were times that people are going, did the cloud just move? We've been here for a long time. How many days have we been in this spot? See, in the wilderness, if we want to survive, we're going to have a centered faith and a following faith, a faith that roots itself in the presence of God and is prepared to move when God moves. As a people of God, we have to center our faith, we have to center our lives on the presence of God and attune our eyes of faith to know when God is on the move, so that we move when He moves, that we settle in and wait and refuse to move until He's ready to move. See, the wilderness is often the place we learn to center our faith so that we can follow where God leads. I invite the band to come back. We're going to continue in worship together this morning. There's this thing in us that likes the idea of the wilderness being this romanticized adventure. But more often, it is mundane uneventfulness. And if you've found yourself in a season of life that feels like you are lost in the wilderness, you know exactly what that means. Nothing is happening. And so you feel alone. And you feel lost. You might even feel abandoned. You feel aimless. And you feel restless. Here's what the temptation has been for me in those times. It's tempting in those moments to try and make something happen. It's tempting in those moments to decide to set out on our own to blaze a trail as if somehow getting out of the wilderness was all up to us. But no. The wilderness seems aimless. So you need someone to lead you. You need someone to come and rescue you. And so what good news it is indeed that there is a God who rescues, that there's a God who saves, a God who meets us in the wilderness moments to bring us out of Egypt, to bring us through the wilderness, to bring us to the place that He would promise us to go. The heart of the good news of Jesus, His death and resurrection, is that God steps into the wilderness of the world and redeems the worst the wilderness has to offer us and makes everything new. The wilderness can seem so aimless that it convinces us to try to make our own way. But what might happen? What might happen if you find yourself in the wilderness and you let it be the place you learn to center your faith in the presence of God so that you can follow where He leads? Would you pray with me?